Hi everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties. On the trial run before it worked well, but we improvised and it's all good now. So thanks for having me. I'll be speaking about how to run rootkits on unsigned rootkits on Windows 11. My name is Omri. I'm working on OS internals, vulnerability research, malware analysis in Fortinet Israel. I've presented in various conferences in the past, but it's my first time here and in Italy as well. So thanks for having me. We'll talk about a bit what about this driver signing enforcement on Windows, the restrictions that it has, how it's being bypassed in the wild, and how Microsoft tried to protect against it. And then we'll go ahead and show you the new techniques that we built. And we'll also try to run a live demo. Hopefully there won't be any hiccups with that. And then we'll go ahead to show you like the mitigations that we try to come up with and like try to summarize afterwards. I'll start with a warning though. What you're going to see here today might be a bit hard on your eyes. Not because it's that radical, but it's because I'm doing my own slides and I'm really bad with graphics. As an example, you can see that. I'll need to be better at it in the future, though. I've told this joke more than once, and it's not funny as it used to be. So, starting off, basically, driver signing enforcement, or DSE, is a quite a well-known feature by now. Basically, when you try to run some code, you can check it if it's signed or not, and specifically when you try to run a driver on Windows, then it has to be signed digitally. Microsoft did some tricks there that initially like had you get a digital certificate only from a specific vendor, only from a specific set of CAs. And then along the years, they changed that you have to go through them. And basically, they have to sign your driver as well, which for attackers is not really ideal because you literally hand your payload to the defenders, which is obviously what you try to avoid. And those signatures are being tested and verified each time that the driver is loaded into memory. So specifically how it works, if we look on the left-hand side of the slide, basically when the kernel starts, during the boot phase of the operating system, it will try to initialize the code integrity feature, which is implemented in an additional kernel library, which is called CI-DLL. All of the symbols that you see here are private. They are not exported, except for the one in red, the CI initialize. Basically, what the process does is try to set some global flags that will state, that controls the states of the feature, and provide callbacks, initialize an array of callbacks for an internal function in CI-TLL back to the kernel. Then, when you try to load some driver, and the kernel will call wrapper functions. In this example, we have the SE validate image header and SE validate image data, which eventually just invoke the callbacks, as you can see in the disassembly on the right. Along the years, there have been a few changes with each different operating system version. Starting with Windows 8, basically, there's only one flag that will control the state of the CI of code integrity. Also, the callback structure changed. Again, it's an internal structure. It's not exported. But basically, the core callbacks that we mentioned are still there. The flow for using them changed a bit. as only one callback will be used during this process, and the name of the private symbol changed. But this is just will be a reference for later. So how can you bypass this restriction? Well, the obvious solution is to get your own valid certificate. Either you steal one or you get some CA to assign you one, or you can try to run some shellcode past, like as a result of some vulnerability that you exploited, but that's not that, let's say, comfortable. At the end, like writing assembly code and shell code, it's likely not as easy or comfortable as just writing C code and having a compiler run it, build it. And there are also some complexities to it when you try to run it in the kernel. Kernel mode is not that nice environment. So the last thing that usually attackers do is just disable this enforcement on runtime and just leverage the entire OS as the normal process of loading a driver is. What they do is simply flipping the control bits of the flags, changing them on runtime using a kernel write primitive. Those flags, again, are internal, they are not exported, but finding them is quite easy with a simple pattern matching. Again, they overwrite it and load their driver, and they restore it so they avoid some protections. To get the kernel write primitive, they usually bring their own driver or their own vulnerable driver, which is just some driver from a known vendor usually that has some poor coding done to it, or that they found some way to leverage a vulnerability in it. So in order to deal with that, Microsoft introduced a few protection mechanisms. The first one is patch guard. For those of you who are familiar with the Windows environment, it basically prevents you from doing modifications to kernel data structures and code for long periods of time. If it will detect a change, it will just blue screen the system. And it's being updated with each new version. Since PatchGuard wasn't that effective, Microsoft tried to introduce new ways to protect against it. The first one is using a driver blocklist in order to prevent attackers from gaining the kernel primitive, kernel write primitive. Basically, it's being enforced via Windows Defender or the secure kernel. I included a link to the latest list on the Microsoft website. There's a small asterisk there. A few weeks back, there was quite a hot debate on Twitter that the researcher tried to look at how much this list is actually effective. I'm not sure if Twitter is there anymore, but yeah, in these days you can't know. But you can try to look it up later. The bottom line was that he found out the list wasn't updated for like 2 or 3 years, and it wasn't even pushed to the endpoints, even though the docs claimed otherwise. And maintaining block lists is obviously not that simple. It constantly makes you need to run around it, run after the attackers and see what happens. And in order to try a new approach that it should be better, Microsoft tried to use Kernel Data Protection, which is a new feature based on their virtualization-based security architecture, in order to prevent changes to this, to prevent being able to change the actual flags in memory during runtime. It's a fairly new feature, as you can see. Basically, with VBS, with the kernel, you have an additional kernel which is called the secure kernel. I mentioned it before. Basically, the kernel itself doesn't run alone anymore, but it runs with an hypervisor. And then with the hypervisor, there is an additional set of permissions that is basically being enforced by the hardware, by the CPU, because you have 2 page tables now when you try to access memory. And the secure kernel basically maintains this the second page table that the regular kernel can't access. And once you ask the secure kernel to protect these areas of memory, it will just take off the write protection, write permissions from those pages, and then you won't be able to write there anymore. So how it looks on CI/DLL, how it was implemented. Basically, as you can see on the left, the global variable is now being protected during the initialization phase of CI/DLL. And the variable was put in its own data section, which will be very helpful for us in quite a bit. That data section is called the CI policy. That's just for future reference. So let's go ahead and start talking about our new techniques. Basically, the flow, again, just for a quick reminder, for a DSE tampering is locate, overwrite, load, and revert. We'll focus on the two main points, two first points, the locate and override. The load obviously stayed the same, and revert is just the same as overwrite, but doing the other way around. So first off, the first technique that we called, that we named in a very creative way, it's called page swapping. Instead of just trying to write to a page that is not writable, why not create our own page that is writable, place the value that we expect in it, and just mess around with the virtual address mapping. So we create our own page just for the illustration, and then in order to basically trick the CI DLL, we just need to change the virtual address mapping. Basically, change the PTE in the page table, as you can see. And then the entire mapping flow changes, and the CPU will see, the CPU will get to the, basically our value that we control on. So I'll just go over the steps quickly. We allocate the memory. Which is writable. We need to find the CI options flag just as was done before. There's nothing new in that. In order to mess with the PTEs, we can do that using their virtual address. There is a place, there's an area in memory, in kernel memory, that is called the PTE space. And to just do a simple translation from the virtual address that we need to find its PTE, we need a variable that it's called the PTE base. It's being randomized right now by a KSLR, but fortunately for us, we already had to tackle this issue in a previous research, and there is a way with a single kernel read that you can basically get this value. Okay. This function is exported, it's easy to find, and with one read you can basically find this value that we need. Then we need to find the PFN to the page that we allocated at the start, and copy its entire content and modify the value for the flag. Change the PTE for the original CI options page, load the driver, and restore the PFL. So that's quite long, that's quite complicated, and when I initially implemented it, I wasn't really happy. It involves a lot of kernel reads and kernel writes. So I tried to figure out like a different approach, and apparently with a very minor tweak, we can really like reduce the amount of reads and writes. Instead of allocating memory in kernel space, we can just allocate memory in the user space that we obviously run in. The rest of the process stays pretty much the same with one minor change. We can rely on the default values of that page because all of the data that they moved to, all the variables that they moved to that page, we can kind of assume that what are the default values are for them, just as they are on disk, and it just works. And then we initialize the page to the value that we need to set the global variable, change the PT just as we did before, load the driver, and restore the original PT value. So I talked quite a lot until now, and now you'll probably want to see that I wasn't messing with you and it actually works. So there we go, move here. So I have a Windows build here from about 2 weeks ago. It's the latest Windows 11 Insider build. If we go down, you can see that VBS is on. Okay, you won't see KDP here for some reason, but it's on by default. The first thing we'll start is that I'll try to show you basically that I'll run the existing technique in the wild to bypass KDP, and that should blue screen the system. So far, so good. I'll revert just quickly. Okay. So now, I'll just show you that I have an unsigned driver here. Properties. See, there is no like digital signature tab here. Okay. I'll try to install it. And run it, and this should fail. Right? The driver is not signed. Now I'll run my POC and try to run the driver again, and it started. Skip going over the printing here. It's not that interesting. But here we should be able to see prints from the rootkit, right? Rootkit started, rootkit running, and logging like new process starts. Now if I try to stop the rootkit and run it again, right, I see the rootkit stopped, and running already. No, I started it again instead of stopping it. Yeah, stopped now, and again, that won't run because I reverted back. Go back to the slides. So just to recap here, the number of read writes and the allocation needed for reference. It's still not as good as the current technique in the wild, so I still wanted to try and improve it. So this is why we came up with another technique, which also have a very creative name, that we call the callback swapping. Basically, if we look at how the interface between the kernel and CIDLL, we can see, we will be reminded that basically there are callbacks involved. So why not just, instead of running to the regular CI function and expect it to do the work and return true, or return status success actually, why shouldn't we just change the pointer to another function that will just return the same return value? So let's look for a second how we can do it. Basically, we need to find the callback structure in CentOS. It's not that difficult, basically because CI initialize gets a pointer to it, and it's an imported function, so we can just walk over the import table and find it, find a call for it from the import table. And then from the call to it, just walk back and find the parameter that will point to an uninitialized memory in CentOS, as you can see. Now we need to find a new callback that will just return 0. We can either find some exported function in CentOS, or we can find some gadget in CIDLL. And all of those things we are doing purely in user space. No kernel read is needed. Once we did that, we need to find the original callbacks in user space, again, so we can avoid the kernel reads. Basically, we can find this pattern, the pattern of instructions to initialize the callback in the CI initialize function. And once we did that and we look at the LIA instructions, we can just verify these offsets are for functions. Basically, we can use the unwide information in the DLL, and that will let us know that we probably find the right spot. This allows us to find basically everything we needed, and then by a simple write, we can just override the callback, load the driver, and restore the callback again. So let's try another demo. I'll just clean the log here. So we already saw that the driver is not loaded. And I'll try to run it again. And it started. Just revert it back, so we won't have issues with PatchGuard in the meantime. And we see our rootkit is running. I'll try to stop it again and run it again just so we can see the revert succeeded. And there we go. So one last slide to compare all the techniques. Basically, we can see that callback swapping, at least from Windows 8, works pretty well, and it's quite the same as the current technique in the wild. And that pretty much let us achieve our goal. So we didn't really want to put things, keep things the way they were, and we tried to think about a way that we can maybe introduce some method to deal with this issue, because obviously the current protections that Microsoft delivered are not that ideal. So the thought that we have was, why not just try to leverage the same principles that attacker use? Why not just try to verify like to find out what the current state of DSE during runtime. We can use the same logic to find the same internal variables in our own, and then we just need to like save their initial state that we run in, when we start. The reason for that is that, again, because of PatchGuard, those changes have to be momentarily, so it's kind of a fair assumption that when we'll start running, DSE state will be valid. We copy the values when we start, and then we need to figure out how to intercept the driver loading procedure. We can do that by placing a user mode hook, but that's pretty weak. We can instead try to use kernel callbacks, either on registry or on file system access, and then verify, basically look up the internal variables again and match them to the state that we captured. And in order to block the driver loading at this stage, we can just either deny the IO request, or we can just like rewrite the variables on our own to the initial state that we captured, and then the OS just will deny the driver loading itself. Okay. So to sum up, data-oriented mitigations are pretty difficult to implement, even if in the views of some researchers in Microsoft. It's pretty interesting to see how different groups in the same organizations view different problems, view the same problems differently. You can use the mitigations that we suggested, but honestly, the real solution for it is to enable another technology by Microsoft, another security mitigation that it's called HVCI. I kind of skipped it at the beginning. It's short for hypervisor code integrity. Basically, the secure kernel can also do the additional validation of the code signature, and keep the same permissions like KDP does, just instead of using the write bit, use the execute bit. And then basically attackers won't be able to bypass it. This feature exists for like 7 years now, but for some reason it's not on by default till now. They're just starting to deploy that, or started to deploy it with the latest Windows 11 builds. And again, DSE won't completely disappear, because at the end of the day, we'll always have misconfigured systems or legacy systems that exist for quite long after we wish them to not be here. And you have all the details in our blog here that we linked. And thank you very much. Any questions?
I actually have 2 questions. The first one is that you said, as you showed in the demos, we can only just briefly turn off the protections, load in our malicious driver, and then turn back on, because otherwise patch defender or something will just blue screen the system, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And the other question I wanted to ask is, why did you keep track? Why are the kernel calls important? Like you had the timeline of you reducing the number of write calls and read calls that you do from the kernel side. Are those important because they require additional privileges, or are they tracked by antiviruses or something like that? Why is that a metric that you kept referencing through the slides? Okay.
So basically, my assumption in this research was that gaining the write and read primitives is difficult. Okay. Because block lists are great, but like at the end I wanted to take the more more restrictive approach, and like assume that you get it via some kernel exploit, okay? And so when you have a kernel exploit, you probably want to reduce the amount of time that you trigger it. Okay, so this is why I wanted to do it as much as, to use that as much as less as I could. And also because I compared it to the current technique in the wild to tamper with DSE, which is fairly simple, okay? Just run right, so it won't be that appealing for attackers to use.
Okay, thank you.
Great talk. I was just curious what your thoughts were around NSA's recent announcement around trying to move organizations away from C and C++ to Rust and more secure kind of kernel languages.
I think it's interesting. It's gonna take quite a while, especially with all the third-party drivers. But at the end, like most of these vulnerable drivers, it's by design. It's not like it's not that they have like it's more like logical bugs, okay? It's like they just take parameters from user space calls and just pass it to kernel, to kernel APIs, and stuff like that. It's not like some very complex like memory corruptions or stuff like that. So on that front, I don't think Rust will do a lot of help.
Thank you.
It seems to me that sometimes these these vulnerabilities are intentional because they don't activate the right defender system. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm not sure which bugs are you meaning, like are you referring to?
An example, the not activation of the right defender system, like HVCI, I don't remember.
No, this is like a Microsoft decision. It's probably because I don't really know, I just assume that they had compatibility issues, like with probably with third-party drivers, so they decided to postpone it until they like forced vendors to fix everything. So it's not like, it's probably not what they set out, like what they hoped for this feature 7 years ago, but that's just the price of having such a long-running OS and user base.
Thank you.
Thanks again, Omri, for his talk.
Thank you.